It always starts off with, all right, well, let's just get it out there. It's nothing like the slavery in the antebellum South. What people mean when they say that, though, in my experience, is the laws in the Hebrew Bible are nothing like what we know was practiced in the antebellum South. How do they hold these things in tension? Right? Well, they come up with this idea, all right, where you can moderately correct them, but you can't abuse them or kill them. I mean, it's exactly what we see, the same tension, the same legal rationale that we see in Exodus 21, 20 to 21. The point is that the system was abused. I mean, that's why the laws were in place. If we're going to come to the biblical texts and you're going to hold to a position that they're the inspired, inerrant Word of God, you have to grapple with it in such a way that you don't become what I can only call a slavery apologist. Funniest part about this whole thing is if you just go back and look, there are like 4 Neo-Assyrian kings. They lay siege to Tyre. Ashurbanipal actually says in one of his inscriptions, on his way back on a campaign, he takes it like that. But Nebuchadnezzar, for 13 years, can't take that little, what?
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true Gnosis. I'm with Dr. Joshua Bowen. He is a Assyriologist. I almost said Egyptologist. I was like, what? Not Egyptologist, Assyriologist. And also,
I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough to be an Egyptologist. That's top tier stuff up there.
Yeah. Well, also the author of the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, which is, to me, a classic. I've read it a couple times.
Thank you.
At my job that I just actually left not too long ago, we used to be able to listen to audiobooks, and whenever I couldn't think of something to put on, I'll just throw on Josh Bowen. So I kind of am pretty familiar with it. But I want to talk about the slavery in the Old Testament, and the reason why I want to have a video on this is you oftentimes hear about the difference between modern slavery, slavery in the United States, the slave trade, and slavery in the Old Testament, which sometimes people will say, well, it wasn't as bad. No, they had slave rights, they had laws to make sure you couldn't hurt the slaves. What do you say when you hear something like that?
Yeah, I mean, ew, gross is usually it comes to mind. I guess I don't say that out loud, but
Right.
I was actually in a Twitter live this afternoon with Scott from Theoretical Bullshit, I think is his Twitter handle. And he's been engaging with somebody online. Nice guy, the guy he's been engaging with. Obviously, Scott's a nice guy. But essentially the conversation opened with, well, this guy saying, well, I don't really think that the slavery in the Old Testament was immoral. Is my reaction to that, right?
It's pretty cringe. It is.
It's like saying, I don't think it was necessarily immoral for God to command the genocide of the Amalekites. So yeah, I mean, and this is where this goes, right? It always starts off with, all right, well, let's just get it out there. It's nothing like the slavery in the antebellum South. What people mean when they say that, though, in my experience, is the laws in the Hebrew Bible, the laws in the Old Testament, are nothing like what we know was practiced in the antebellum South. So in the same way that, like if speeding in LA is a huge problem, right? Or if, there's a huge, burglary spree or something, in a particular city, or the murder rate's really high in, a particular city or something. You would say, like, I'm very close to Baltimore. Baltimore has, I guess, a pretty, it's not my expertise, but, you could easily say, well, gosh, I mean, like, everybody is speeding like crazy in LA, or everybody's getting killed up in Baltimore, or in Chicago or wherever. But, that's not a statement about the laws. It's a statement about what's practiced. And that's what people are thinking of when they think about slavery in the antebellum South, in my experience in these discussions. And so they'll say things like, slaves got murdered. Yep, they absolutely did. Slaves were viciously abused. Yep, they absolutely were. And it is horrific. And we should never, ever, ever do anything that will take us back anywhere near that. But you know what will do that? Slavery apologetics in the Old Testament. That's what's going to take us back there. Because in the chapter on slavery in my book, one of the things that I wanted to do is sort of dive into that comparison that's always made. Because what I found is, if you're going to make the comparison, you need to make the comparison between apples and apples, which would mean, what were the laws in the antebellum South about slavery? And I won't go into the detail here, but did you know it was illegal to abuse your slave in the antebellum South? Did you know that some of the laws said, particularly coming into just before the Civil War, if you murder a slave, it's like murdering, the penalty would be the same as murdering a free white person? Yeah.
I didn't know that.
I didn't know that either. There's a great book by a guy named Thomas Morris, called, I think it's Laws. Yeah, I can't remember the title, but it's like Slavery Laws in Antebellum South or something. That's not it, but it's something like that. It's in the bibliography in my book. But you hear that, and you read about what the judges do, or the legislators do in the antebellum South when they're wrestling with what to do with these slave laws. And what they're wrestling with is, they believe that masters need to be able to beat their slaves in order to motivate them. So they need to be able to do moderate correction. But they also, the law views, is trying to take into account the humanity of the slave. And so how do they hold these things in tension? Right. Well, they come up with this idea. All right. Well, you can moderately correct them, but you can't abuse them or kill them. Well, I mean, sound like Exodus 21 to anybody else? I mean, it's exactly what we see, the same tension, the same legal rationale that we see in Exodus 21, 20 to 21. So the scary thing to me is, I don't think any Christian apologist that I know or evangelical would argue for, well, let's look at how the laws were trying to protect the slaves in the antebellum South.
Right.
And I hope they wouldn't do that, because that's horrific. How about we just don't own people's property? But they're very quick to do it when it comes to the Old Testament. And to me, that is quintessentially those that forget the past are doomed to repeat it. Yeah. So yeah, that's the thing that I always, and that's what I said today. I won't even debate the topic, was slavery immoral or is slavery immoral? I start there, right? That's that's axiomatic for me. Owning another person's property is immoral. Yeah. So,
and I'm thinking that you make a great point, because what it says in the laws doesn't reflect what people are actually doing. And we have laws that say, battery and assault is illegal, but we still have relationships where men beat their wives or whatever. There's all types of people don't follow the laws. What we should be focusing on is what is actually happening.
You can see it in the biblical text itself. So if you go to places like Jeremiah 34 or Nehemiah 5, it talks about ways that the Israelites were not ostensibly not practicing the Mosaic law.
Mm.
Now, there's obviously, from a text critical standpoint, there's a whole direction that we could go about these historical narratives or whatever. But the point is that the system was abused. I mean, that's why the laws were in place, and not just in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, just everywhere, right? I mean, this is in the ancient Near East. This is why those laws were in place. And so I think that if we're going to do this, if we're going to come to the biblical texts, and you're going to hold to a position that they're the inspired, inerrant Word of God, then when you grapple with something like genocide or something like rape in the laws of the Old Testament, or violence and genocide, and something like slavery, or the value of a slave, you have to grapple with it in such a way that you don't become what I can only call a slavery apologist.
Right.
Because, you talk to this good friend of mine, and you may know Jay Caballero. He's been on
Sure.
Been on Derek's channel a couple of times. Jay's a wonderful guy, brilliant, writing his dissertation on sex crimes in the ancient Near East and the Hebrew Bible. And he's studying underneath of Bruce Wells, who is a brilliant ancient Near Eastern legal specialist. And actually, Jay is interesting because he's doing ancient, studying ancient law, and he was a defense attorney for 22 years before he started his PhD. And I think he's actually up for a judgeship right now. So he's a really interesting, and he's a power lifter. He's like 6'6", wow. And he can like deadlift way more than I can. Anyway, but he came on Derek's stream and said, yeah, it's slavery. It's bad. It's debt and chattel and sex slavery, and don't sugarcoat it. Right. Is bad. And I just think it's very, very dangerous once you start making excuses for slavery in any period. It's a bad road to go down. Yeah,
you're just going into a one-way direction.
Yeah.
There's nothing good coming from that.
Yeah.
I noticed that there's this peculiar law, and I'm not sure what it says and how it's translated, if it's translated correctly, right? But it's along the lines of if a slave runs away,
yeah,
they can you can just take them in, and it's okay. You're like, yeah, just take them in, no big deal. What is this about?
So this is Deuteronomy 23:15-16, or 16-17, depending on if you're reading the Hebrew Bible or English. But the law is, if a slave runs away, you are not to return him to his master. You are to let him stay in one of the towns wherever he chooses, and you are not to abuse him. And the way that apologists they'll tout this out, right? And they'll say, see, if a slave runs away, you can't return him. And my response nowadays is, bro, that's not the flex you think it is. Because what that text is referencing, and I actually revisited that passage a little bit recently because I'm teaching a course on slavery in the Old Testament and ancient Near East. And it's almost uniformly understood that is referring to foreign slaves from foreign countries who are escaping across the border into Israel. And what the law actually is saying is you take a hands-off approach. So if you think about the laws in the wider ancient Near East when it comes to harboring slaves, it's bad, right? You do not harbor slaves because it's like you've stolen them. So what the law is trying to do, I think, is twofold. And again, these aren't my ideas. This is sort of consensus scholarship. One, it's trying to make sure that Israel doesn't have extradition treaties with the nations that are around them. Because the way that, this, you can see it in the other law collections, or just in these treaties in general. If a slave escapes across the border, you can even see it in the Hebrew Bible. There are instances where a slave will say, "Hey, I'll tell you, the information that you want. Just don't return me to my master, who's a foreigner." So if you have extradition treaties set up, then if a slave runs away, you're supposed to return them, and vice versa. But because, particularly in Deuteronomy, Israel is supposed to be the head and not the tail, right? It's supposed to be this. You see this in just a couple chapters before, in Deuteronomy 20, with the rules of warfare, the rules of engagement. Everybody's an enemy, right? So you have everybody that's in Canaan, everybody in the land proper, the promised land, they all get killed, right? They're exterminated. They're under the ban. Those that are outside of Canaan, though, you lay siege, or you offer them vassalage first. It's, the text says you offer them peace. But then if they don't accept it and they shut up their walls and their gates and everything, and they get behind their walls, then you lay siege. And then when you break through, you kill all the men and you take the women and children and cattle and stuff as plunder. So the idea that you're going to have this parity treaty, this equality between these nations that are outside and Israel, was anathema. Like, we're not doing that, right? So what that text is trying to say is, if they escape from across the border, and one of the reasons that they conclude this is the way the verse 17 reads, because it says, you let them stay in the city, any of the cities that he chooses. Well, if this is talking about an Israelite, that doesn't make any sense, because an Israelite had property to go back to.
Right. Oh, yeah.
So you wouldn't say wherever he wants to. No, if he's from Dan, he's going back to his plot. Then if he's Naphtali, he goes back up there.
Wow, that's such a good point.
So yeah, it's not the flex they think it is.
I just thought of this too. So it sounds so ridiculous if it was an Israelite law, because wouldn't every slave just be running around from house to house?
Yeah.
Wouldn't it just, like, I'm protected under the law, so I'm just going to go running around. I'm not going to be a slave anymore. I'm just going to start running from house to house every day.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, that's not even logical.
Yeah. I mean, this is like, there are two scholars that I know of that have entertained the possibility, and they don't really give reasons for it. Tikva Frymer-Kensky in Raymond Westbrook's 2-volume edited Ancient Near Eastern Law collections, huge. And then Richard Averbeck, who's out at Trinity. And Richard Averbeck has an entry in this, it's like a 2018, 2019 book, Behind the Scenes of the Old Testament, I think is what it's called. And it's a great book. Evangelical slant, but it's a great book.
Sure. And
he's got the entry on slavery. And the chapter's wonderful. It really is. The entry's wonderful. Except that part about Deuteronomy, because he's like, and so, if a slave runs away, you can't return him. And like nothing more. He just says it. It's like,
didn't explore it at all.
Yeah, it's like, wait. But this is the thing. Frymer-Kensky says, if I'm remembering what she wrote, she says, if this is about just any slave that runs away, it completely undermines the entire system. Because if you think about this, Neil, it's like, if I take out a loan from you, I'm a fellow Israelite, I take out a loan from you, and I can't pay it back, you have the right to come and take me or take a member under my control in my household, be it my slave or one of my sons or daughters, or even my wife. I can give them over to you, and they serve you as a debt slave for 6 years and are released in the 7th. Well, if I have my son go over, and as he leaves, I say, Jimmy, just run away the first chance you get, and it's all good,
The law
right?
protects you.
Now, I mean, it undermines the entire system, right? So, and Deuteronomy itself, in Deuteronomy 15, has a whole set of rules about slaves, right? It's one of the 3 places in the law collections that talk about slaves, and it's pretty extensive, Deuteronomy 15. So, it seems sort of stupid, to us, not stupid, but I mean, like, it seems
Right.
odd to conclude that here in 15 it lays out all these rules for debt slavery, but then 8 chapters later it says, but if you just run away, it's all good, your debt's canceled and stuff. It's like, what?
Right. It's like, that's not even slavery anymore. That's, you're free now. It's like, so I don't know. Yeah, I agree. I think that makes a lot of sense. I wanted to read this particular verse from Exodus.
Okay.
It has to deal with sex slaves. I want to hear what you think about this. It says, this is the NLT version.
Okay.
When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she will not be freed at the end of 6 years, as men are. If she does not please the man who bought her, he may allow her to be bought back again. But he is not allowed to sell her to foreigners, since he is the one who broke the contract with her. And if the slave girl's owner arranges for her to marry his son, he may no longer treat her as a slave girl, but he must treat her as his daughter. Wow. If he himself marries her and then takes another wife, he may not reduce her food or clothing or fail to sleep with her as his wife. If he fails in any way of these 3 things, she may leave as a free woman without making payment. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, welcome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, I can walk everybody through it, but I mean, it means what it says, right? So if you start back in verse 2, this is the earliest law collection in the Hebrew Bible, arguably, and it starts off saying, if what are the laws if a male Israelite sells himself as a debt slave to another Israelite? And the laws are, you keep him for 6 years, set him free in the 7th, right? And if he comes in and he's married, then when he goes out, his wife goes with him. If when he comes in, he's unmarried and the master gives him a wife, then any of the wife and any of the children that they have while he is serving his debt servitude are chattel slaves. They belong to the master. They don't go free. So it's just working through the different scenarios for when a male debt slave comes in. So then the text turns in verse 7 and says, well, what about if it's a woman, right? What if it's a young lady who's coming in and the father is selling her into concubinage, essentially? What are the rules? Well, she's not released as the male slaves are. Now, that probably was a protection for her, as weird as that sounds.
Right.
Because one of the things that is striking to us, to say it mildly, is that slaves were used in the ancient Near East for reproductive purposes.
Wow.
So if you think about it, think about the scenario in verses 2 to 6. Male debt slave comes in and you give him a female slave, his wife, and they have 3 kids, let's say, or 5 kids. Guess what you've got? You got 5 slaves.
Yeah.
I mean, it's atrocious, right? But they are chattel slaves. They're house-born slaves, and they stay in the master's house. They're not subject to release. So the same is true with slight modification in verses 7 through 11. The difference is that this is now the master or the master's son, both free people, that are taking this, potentially taking this young girl as either their bride, either their wife, or as their concubine. In either case, the status is changed to some degree because they're being used for sexual purposes. Notice that he marries her, but then it says if he takes another wife.
Right.
So, you know.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah. Pay attention, apologists. Like,
yeah.
Is this the hill you want to die on?
Well,
it's like,
first question I have about this is, what do they mean by she does not please the man? Is that sexual? Is that?
Yeah. I mean, it's debated specifically what it means. I think that the law is probably general to allow the guy to get rid of her no matter what.
Yeah. Yeah. That, wow. Makes
yeah.
sense.
I don't think it's, I think it's up to him what is displeasing.
Right. Because then it says if she fails in any of these three ways, she may become a free woman. But how would she prove her word against a man's word in this world?
Yeah. And this is where, like, that question is the right, what is it that the guy said in iRobot? That detective is the right question. Hopefully I'm not the only person that's seen iRobot that's watching this, but I'm a big Will Smith fan, so
yeah, it's a good movie.
But asking that question leads you to think down this road go down this road we were talking about earlier. So if we implement these laws, right, this is exactly what happened in the antebellum South. Guess what? You're not allowed to abuse your slave beyond moderate correction. Well, how do you prove that? Well, I mean, you're not listening to the slave, right? So who you listening to? Well, you have to have a credible witness. Well, who's that going to be? Well, another slave owner probably.
And he's going to have his back.
I mean, this isn't rocket science,
right?
You know? So yes, that is the right question. And again, the law is best case scenario. The law is being written here to try to protect the slave, but doing it very ineffectively, I think.
I think it's also a possibility that this could be written in as a tool for situations where they do want to protect a slave. Let's say the slave happens to be a slave of somebody who's really important, like a high priest or something. And that person wants to protect his slave somehow, or something happens where, okay, we have it in the law just in case we need it. But in other situations, in most situations, probably this woman is not going to be able to prove her case. And so she's not going to be protected at all.
Yeah. And it's the thing that's, I think, again, because so often, almost always when I'm discussing these issues, I'm not discussing them with like other academics in the field because this is a non-issue.
Sure.
Right. I'm always discussing them with Christian apologists online and just trying to get them to say, yes, Old Testament slavery, not good. Yeah, can we get there? Right. And often we can't. So in that context, normally the way they're coming at this is these are the laws handed down in prescriptive fashion by Yahweh.
Right.
Right. So it's much more complicated than that in real life, right? Are these laws scribal exercises originally? Are these laws descriptions of what was normative? Is it something that is sort of become fossilized? And so they don't actually describe what's going on. These are just like, is it possible these are just scribal wish lists, right? This is the way we think it ought to be. These are all very complicated issues trying to get down to what actually are these law collections, not just the ones in the Hebrew Bible, but in the ancient Near East in general. That's all hotly debated. But the thing is, none of that really comes up in online discussions normally because we're just taking it as axiomatic that this is the inspired word of God and these are handed down from Yahweh. And if that's the case, warning, danger, Will Robinson. Like, God.
And speaking of Yahweh handing these down, these perfect laws that are from God, how do they stack up against other nations around, Babylonian, Egyptian, Hittite, whatever? Is there a lot of similarities, a lot of overlap with these laws?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So different scholars will come at this with like it's sort of on a scale. Um, Somebody like I think it's Christopher Wright wrote a book, and he's essentially arguing that like Exodus 21, that section in Exodus 21, is like directly borrowing from the laws of Hammurabi.
Wow.
It's not just like it's not just a legal system that has sort of infected the air, right, and been transmitted that way. It's like here's the laws of Hammurabi, and you know,
Right.
um,
And then you got the eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. I mean, that's like
yeah,
that's such a specific phrase.
yeah. There's no question. Like I don't think there's anybody that would argue that there's not um, borrowing either direct or indirect. It's a scale. It's a matter of how much. So, for example, I give this when I talk about plagiarism in the mythology of the Hebrew Bible. There are some places that I think it's absolutely clear that they're actually thinking about this particular myth, right, and they're utilizing it. There are other places where I think it is something that has infected the water,
Mhm.
right? And it's clearly coming from this earlier mythological tradition. But are they directly thinking about it? It's sort of like, if I were to say to be or not to be, like, I don't know that I could tell you precisely which of Shakespeare, it's Othello or Hamlet. I can't remember which one.
I think that's
Terrible.
Hamlet. I think that's Hamlet.
Yeah. But I can't tell you the context. I can't tell you what's going on. It's a stock phrase, but it's clearly borrowed from Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Right. But that's a very different thing than what Eminem is doing when he's utilizing Joan Jett's I Love Rock and Roll.
Right.
Right. He knows where he's pulling it from. He knows specifically, and he's making an attempt to mirror that. And sort of in between those two, I just have these examples because I use them all the time.
Yeah, yeah.
If you've seen Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, they say that they're trying to pull, they're intentionally pulling from the Odyssey.
Yes.
But I think they're failing because some of the scenes that they're pulling from, it's like, have you read this? Like, because that's so there are all these different versions of borrowing.
Right.
And another one would be if I were to walk around the house and start using the phrase sponge-worthy, right, from Seinfeld, yeah. Right? He's not sponge-worthy. And my daughter, who's never seen Seinfeld, like starts to pick up on it in context and starts to use sponge-worthy herself. She has no idea where it comes. She thinks it's coming from me. She doesn't know where it's originally coming from. Is she borrowing from Seinfeld? Yes, indirectly, right? It's in other words, she owes that phrase ultimately to Seinfeld. But is she directly thinking about it? Is she plagiarizing? No, like that's not what's happening. So in the same way, we don't know exactly how these laws are interacting with one another in these legal collections, but that discussion almost goes by the wayside when you have these discussions online because a Christian apologist isn't entertaining those. This is handed down to Moses on Mount Sinai, right?
Right.
The end. So you can kind of engage with them there.
And what's okay? So and the thing about that is this. So eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, I think, is the best example. It's everyone it's easy to remember. It's not like one saying hand for a hand and leg for a leg, and the other one say they both literally have the same body parts. Like it's clear that they're borrowing that particular verse. Now, wouldn't you now have to say that God either inspired Hammurabi or, I mean, wouldn't you have to sort of go in that direction? Or you would have to say that Hammurabi was close or something. Like, what? Don't you have to sort of? Aren't you forced to sort of make that like a thing, right?
There is. I don't know if you follow Dark Matter.
Yes, absolutely.
He had a video. I don't know if it's most recent, but
I saw the one where he mentioned you in it. It was
yeah. So he messaged me and he said, "I've got this," and he wrote it like nobody should.
Yeah.
It was a great script and he wrote it. Like I made some suggestions, but it's a phenomenal script, phenomenal idea. I think he did a great job with it.
Right.
But in this, you know, in the for those that haven't seen it, I encourage you to go watch it because it's hilarious. But he has Yahweh as a kid standing at Poly High.
Yeah, that's right.
And his teacher is saying now, Yahweh, I need to talk to you about this assignment that you turned in, about how you flooded the entire world and killed everybody. Yeah, what about it? Well, are you aware of the Sumerians and the Akkadians, Yahweh? No. Well, long before you wrote your story, you have Atrahasis and Gilgamesh who are writing it. And he says, well, how do you know they didn't borrow it from me?
It sounds like an apologist, too.
Yahweh, I'd like to talk to you about your report that you handed in last Friday about what you did over the last millennium. I believe you titled it Genesis.
Yeah, what about it?
Now, did you really flood the entire world exactly as it says in your Genesis report?
Of course. Exactly as I wrote it, it happened.
Yahweh, have you ever read the Epic of Gilgamesh?
No. Why?
Well, hundreds of years before you wrote Genesis, some of the older gods wrote a school play called The Epic of Gilgamesh. And in their story, the gods got upset with mankind, so they decided to flood the entire world, same as you. But before they did, one of the gods warned a very righteous man to build a boat to save himself and his family and all the animals. Sound familiar? The righteous man complained about it, same as your story, but eventually agreed. The boat had specific dimensions with many compartments inside, one door, at least one window, and the outside of it was coated in pitch, same as your story. Now, the entire world was flooded with a deluge, and the boat finally came to rest on a mountain approximately 300 miles from the mountain in your story. The righteous man released birds to find land, including a dove, a raven, same as your story. And after they did, the righteous man sacrificed animals and was then blessed, same as your story. A promise is even made to never flood the world again. Now, Yahweh, their story was written way before your story. Are you going to tell me your wet and wild Genesis tale wasn't lifted directly from them? Now, let's hear it. What's your defense?
No.
Yahweh, this story isn't even worth stealing. It's rife with all kinds of logistical problems. It's not even a practical way for an omnipotent being to behave, let alone a supposedly benevolent one.
Well, how do you know they didn't steal it?
Well, in fact, they did. They got in trouble for stealing that story from some of the other students who came before them.
Really?
Yes, indeed. And even those students stole it from some of the other students before them. So you see, it's very old. Way older than your story.
So, how do you know it didn't really happen?
Well, in most...
How do you know they didn't borrow it from me? Yeah, there was a time traveler that, you know, came to the future and stole your dope idea.
That was a great video.
Yeah, it was really good. I really enjoyed it. But that's sort of the so, you know, in order to argue for a certain level of direct borrowing, or even indirect borrowing, you have to consider things like, was there the possibility of overlap? Was there the possibility of contact? There's a great book, an edited volume. Zioni Zevit is the editor, but Joel Baden's got an article in there. Zevit himself has an article in there. A bunch of other really good scholars that are talking about intertextuality, and how these texts interact with one another, including the legal sections. And so there are all these different factors, but the bottom line here is that if you have a clear connection between two texts, the one that comes later can't be the source. Right. I mean, so yes, that's what you would have to argue. And what evangelicals will do, what Christian apologists will do very often is say, well, there's an event, and I'm sure you've heard this 1,000 times, but there's an event, there's a flood event, the real flood event, that the Sumerians had their own version of it. And then later on, the Israelites got their version of it, but that's the true version, right?
The true version was remembered later, but it was forgot for a while. Then what do you remember? And then 1,000 years later, oh yeah, I remember the real version now. What you could argue there is that, well, wait a minute, Israel didn't develop as a nation until like the 13th century. The problem is that you would then have to, we don't see a flood tradition. It should be in Egypt then.
Yeah, I guess that too.
Yeah, because that's where they were. I mean, if they came out of Egypt like they said they did, that we should be able to trace back some sort of Jewish temple in Egypt where they worship Yahweh, and they had the flood myth there, and they carried that down all the way to, you know what I mean? You'd think you'd see something like that.
But I mean, I think even more perhaps to the point or damning is, like, everybody agrees that anybody that knows the topic will agree that this comes from Mesopotamia.
Right.
It's Mesopotamian origin. The problem is that a book was written 2012, I think, by I always forget the guy's last name. Anyway, but he's basically showing, and I think fairly convincingly, that the tradition of the flood in Mesopotamian literature didn't develop until the early second millennium. Now, that may not sound meaningful, but if you're arguing for even a local flood, even a regional flood, as opposed to like a worldwide flood, in the middle of the third millennium, we have a lot of documents from the third millennium in Mesopotamia. We know a lot about what was going on there. There's this guy Sargon,
happened to be a guy who was in a basket and
right.
A lot of that going on,
But the reality here is that you would have to have this civilization know nothing about this, say nothing about it for 500 years. And then all of a sudden it starts showing up everywhere in the literary tradition. So, I don't know.
Yeah. But, and another thing about that is, well, first of all, you can see other areas in the world where they are borrowing from the similar, that probably all comes from the same Sumerian source, but it's not just the Israelites, because the Greeks, Hesiod, wrote about a character named Deucalion, I think I said his name, Deucalion, who was the son of Prometheus. And interestingly enough, Zeus wants to flood the world, and this is the sort of tied to the Atlantis myth, and Prometheus tells his son, who's immortal, you better build he doesn't say ark, he says chest. He says, you and your wife go in the chest. They don't save any animals, just him and his wife go into a chest, and they survive the Atlantis flood. But I think there's enough there, a god telling a mortal, the creator is going, not the creator, but the sovereign God is about to flood everything. You better build something. Maybe it's not an ark, but it's a chest. Okay. I think there's enough there where you can say, I think Hesiod probably knew about this myth too, maybe. But there's also before I want to hear what you think about that, but I want to throw this in there. There's also this argument that I was reading Carl Jung's book called Man and Symbols, and he talks about how when he read Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he noticed a clear passage about something that he remembered seeing from another book, and he didn't know if he was plagiarizing or what, but he found that book and he was like, he compared the two and they were really similar. And apparently Nietzsche was like, no, I didn't borrow from that or whatever. But Carl Jung actually was friends with Nietzsche's sister and asked her if they ever read this book. She said yes. So that led Carl Jung to think he probably read the book, forgot about it.
Yeah.
It was stored somewhere when he was getting his creative process going.
Yep.
And it ended up in the text.
Yep.
So there's always that option too.
Yeah, and that's why I say that so much of this is wonderfully nuanced. And I think that part of the problem, unfortunately, with Christian apologetics, in my experience, is that it flattens what is beautifully nuanced. Because kind of getting back to the slavery thing and the laws, like the discussion about how these laws functioned, like the laws of Hammurabi, that stele that was standing there with the 282 laws on it, this 6-foot diorite thing, or basalt, I can't remember. It used to be thought that the judges would be sitting there, and that people would come up with their case and they'd say, that's interesting. Hang on a second. Okay, yeah. So your ox gored. Now, had the ox done it before? No. Okay. So it's 30 shekels of silver, right? That's like, that was the thought. That's not as popular anymore. So like, what are these laws, right? Are they normative? Are they just descriptive? Are they just propaganda? Like, there are a lot of different ways to think about this, a lot of different angles to come at this through. And like, you can look at the nice thing about Mesopotamian textual data is that we have a lot of originals still, right? We're not dealing with like much later copies.
Right.
So you can actually look at the legal text, you can look at contracts, you can look at court cases, and you can see things like, oh, well, here's a similar case than what we saw here. Do they match up? Not really. So what does that mean? And I'm not a legal specialist.
Right.
So, people should go to people like Bruce Wells and Jay Caballero for this. But, that's an interesting discussion. That's a nuanced discussion. Like there's a book that came out. Actually, it's a 2011, I think, by Laura Culbertson as the editor. And in one of the articles, I think she and Wunsch talk about Judeans. I think the Judeans were living in the Babylonian captivity and looking at how did they utilize the law? Did they follow what we have now, later preserved, or were they doing something completely different in captivity? And that's an interesting, see, those are all very interesting questions. But when you start saying things like, no, it's, Yahweh gave it to him Mount Sinai and that's the normative law, done. I don't know. It just sort of flattens everything and creates a whole world of problems.
Yeah. It
creates for the Christian apologist.
I think it creates more problems because now you have to, so now let's take on the realm of Christianity. Let's take Christianity. Now you have the New Testament, which has its own sort of worldview, its sort of take on, like, Paul's epistles, Jesus's parables. It has its own philosophy, basically. And now you have to, when you have no choice but to stack it up against the Old Testament. And when there's things that contradict, now if you say that God said that, you're going to say, what are you calling God a liar now? What is he changing his mind? So now you have more problems rather than just saying, oh, you know what? People probably wrote that and we've changed our mind now. And by the way, Jesus is better. This, whatever they want to say. I don't know. Just saying. But like, that would be more logical to come with that approach, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think you paint yourself into a corner, and what ends up happening, I think a really funny example of this is, in that atheist handbook, I have a chapter on the prophecy against Tyre, Ezekiel's prophecy against Tyre.
Right.
And to watch some of the dancing online, it's funny.
What's the worst one you've seen?
Oh, so Mike Winger makes this argument that, and maybe he's changed his mind. It's an older video, but I haven't heard him say anything else about it. So, but he makes this argument that Nebuchadnezzar laid siege not to the island city of Tyre, but to the mainland city of Ushu. And when he did, he laid siege to it all the way around, except he couldn't get all the way back behind the city to complete the siege, wall or whatever, because that's the side of the water. And the Navy was bombarding them somehow, I'm not sure, but keeping them from actually connecting the lines, right? So that left this like alley for the people over the 13 years of the siege to sneak out the back door of the city, get on boats, and go with all their shit, ostensibly without Nebuchadnezzar knowing.
This siege continues and goes for 13 years. Well, as they see that they're not going to be able to conquer and beat these armed forces and they'll eventually reach the walls, the people of Tyre begin taking their belongings and their families and everything else and leaving the mainland city and transporting themselves over to the island. The island had massive walls, it was well fortified, and they had a powerful navy to defend it. So they retreat to the island, and finally Nebuchadnezzar breaches the walls. Nebuchadnezzar breaks in, he trots his horses around the city, he takes and steals what he can, but he finds that a lot of the people have retreated off to the island. And he doesn't have the ability to chase them over there. So he kind of goes back, sort of victorious, sort of not. And he heads back up to Babylon after this 13-year siege.
For 13 years. And then he finally gets into Ushu and goes, what the? It's empty. I mean, it's like, the reason, outside of how funny that sounds.
Does he just pull that out of the air? Is there anything he got that from, or?
I don't know, actually. I want to say that maybe Gleason Archer made that argument. I don't remember. But that, to me, the funniest part about this whole thing is if you just go back and look, there are like 4 Neo-Assyrian kings, 3 or 4 Neo-Assyrian kings. I write about it in the chapter. That in the century leading up to, century and a half leading up to Nebuchadnezzar's siege of Tyre, they lay siege to Tyre. And the way that they do it, see, Ushu was the mainland city, one of the mainland cities. And one of the nice things about Ushu is it had a natural spring in it. But if you think about the island of Tyre, islands aren't very good at like having resources. So like fresh water, and they can get it. They have cisterns or whatever. But it's nicer to have water from the spring, right? And then there's like wood and other supplies. And so what they would do is they would utilize Ushu as like a resource line, right? Supply line. Well, all they would do is the army would just line up along the beach. And now you cut off the supply line. That's what you do. Right. And then you just sit there and you wait. Because see, at that point, they can do it. Like they can wait out there on the island. They can hold out for a while, right? Because they do have ships. Sometimes some of the kings would actually take other, like I think Sidonian vessels and like blockade actually around the island to keep them. But like theoretically, they could get out and go, take a boat down and get some supplies down the coast or something, come back up. But it's a real hassle.
Right. And
Ashurbanipal actually says in one of his inscriptions, and this is what, like, this would have been like 627, maybe, I can't remember. So maybe 50 years before Nebuchadnezzar. He says that on a return at the end of one of his annual campaigns, there was a little rebellion going on at Tyre, at Ushu, and he comes and he takes Ushu on his way back home in a campaign. He just takes Ushu, the city of Ushu, takes it. So the idea that on his way back on a campaign, he takes it like that.
Right.
But Nebuchadnezzar for 13 years can't take that little.
No.
I mean, it's what? What? Anyway, so
Right.
yes. But those types of, gymnastics.
And the prophecy is that Tyre will never be rebuilt ever again, if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken. And was rebuilt over and over, and it's still standing today.
Sure.
And another thing is, Alexander laid siege to it in the 320s, or whatever, 330s,
Mhm.
and he actually took the mainland and connected it to the island and made it. There was no more island now. The
That's
island.
right.
So like that, where's the prophecy for that? That could have been a really good prophecy.
Oh yeah.
The island of Tyre will be part of the mainland one day.
Yeah. Yeah. I
It
mean,
happened like that. Didn't you know what I mean?
but this is what's interesting about this, because we were talking about sort of the way that you're forced into weird positions.
Right.
And one of the weird positions that, like, evangelical scholars, so like, I think, again, like Mike's idea is funny, but I don't know where he got it. Maybe he got it from a good source, but well, I mean, a source, or a scholarly source. But the sort of more scholarly response among evangelicals is to say, well, that prophecy is inherently contingent, and they always cite Nineveh with Jonah.
Right.
So if you think about Jonah, Jonah goes and he prophesies against it. But the idea is to get Nineveh to change its mind.
Mm.
So he says, 40 days, God's going to destroy you. They all repent, sackcloth and ashes, the whole 9 yards, and God changes his mind. And so they think, okay, so prophecy then is contingent, right? It's meant to motivate somebody to change. Now that's true. I mean, I think there's actually a lot of truth to that.
Right.
The problem is that that's not the case here we have no evidence that that's the case here in Ezekiel. You just have to sort of conclude that. And what's funny is, so what they'll say is that, well, we don't have any evidence for it, but the king of Tyre must, after 13 years, have repented and changed his mind. And that's why God spared him. So the prophecy didn't have to come true. The problem with this, and they say it, there's a guy named Robert Chisholm that has an article about this. The problem is that in Ezekiel 29, when Ezekiel is sort of updating his prophecy, he says, all right, so, Nebuchadnezzar worked really hard. He didn't get Tyre. So God's going to give him Egypt instead. Well, guess what he doesn't do? Take Egypt.
Right.
And so Chisholm says, so we also, I guess, have to assume that Egypt repented as well. It's like,
I guess there's an answer for everything.
yeah, I mean, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. So
I also find it interesting about the Nineveh thing that they had a fish god was their highest god. Their temple was like Dagon. He was sort of like a fish god. And then Jonah is coming out of a whale or a fish. I almost think there's some sort of connection. I don't know. Maybe I'm just seeing things, but I don't know. It's like I see stuff like that. But the last thing I want to ask you is, where do you think that the slavery laws in the Hebrew Bible, are they worse or the same or better than the ones surrounding the areas of Babylonian and stuff like that?
So there are a couple of, overall they're about the same, right? They're on par. And I suspect that, if you were to go to, it's probably similar to, and again, I'm not a legal specialist, but it's probably similar to if you said, do you think the laws in North Carolina are better or worse than the laws in Alabama, than the laws in North Dakota or whatever? Like there are probably going to be things individually that are better or worse in different ones, but on the whole, they're probably going to be pretty close, right? The same legal rationale stands behind the American justice system. I think,
Yeah.
they're probably on par. So, all things being, all things considered. So that's, I think, a pretty fair description of all of the ancient Near Eastern laws. Now, like, certainly the Middle Assyrian laws are more ruthless in many places than some of the other collections. And there are some places where it seems like the Hebrew Bible is more lenient. There are other places that it's much worse. So, like, if a child hits their parent in Exodus 21:12, I think, they're killed, right? You do that in the laws of Hammurabi, you lose your hand, right? So you could argue that it's much worse in the Hebrew Bible because they die. Of course, what apologists would say there is, no, that's real justice. It's like, okay, well, I mean, I guess he can make anything fit. In the laws of Hammurabi, if you become a debt slave, your term of service is 3 years and you're released in the 4th, free from your debt. In the Hebrew Bible, you serve for 6, released in the 7th. So would they say that that's twice as bad? No, an apologist would probably say, no, because it's such a good life being a slave in Israel. So I mean, again, you can sort of have an answer for all of these things, but there are definitely things that, because the laws in the Hebrew Bible are much later, I don't think it's surprising that in some areas they're more developed. Right. But again, I think, I think on the whole, you'd be hard pressed to say there are tremendous distinctions to be seen between, the laws in the Hebrew Bible and the laws in the ancient Near Eastern law collections. And one more thing that complicates this, because you're dealing with casuistic law, you're dealing with if this, then that types of laws. So often, one law collection will deal with a topic that another one doesn't deal with. So, for example, there's a list. I think it's in the laws of Eshnuna, and they, on a particular topic, they go. I think it's the law of the distrainees. So if somebody owes you a debt and they're late on the payment or whatever, you can go essentially take somebody from their family, and hold them to motivate the person to pay the loan back.
Collateral.
Right? Yeah. And I think in the laws of Eshnuna, they deal with a couple of different examples. But in the laws of Hammurabi, if I'm remembering that correctly, there are more examples of it, more like variations on the case. And so you wouldn't be able to say, well, the laws of Eshnuna, people of Eshnuna didn't care about, they didn't deal with what to do if the creditor seizes the property without having a legal claim or something, because the laws of Hammurabi do, so they care about that, but the laws of Eshnuna don't. Well, that doesn't mean that they didn't care about that. It's just they didn't deal with it in that law collection. So, like, people want to make a big deal out of the runaway slave law in Deuteronomy 23:15-16. It doesn't show up anywhere else in the ancient Near Eastern law collections. Well, that's true. That doesn't mean they didn't have a law about that or they didn't care about that. It seems like probably in the Hittite laws they had something about it, but I think it's the Hittite laws. Anyway, but the point is, just because they don't deal with it in a law collection doesn't mean that they didn't care about it or they didn't have a law about it. Because there aren't many people that would think that this is an exhaustive list of all things legal, right? Because there'd be all kinds of things missing. It wouldn't be a real, that's why they don't call it a code. Because they used to call it a code, but it's not a code, right? Because it's not comprehensive in that sense. So yeah, it's a very complicated, again, nuanced discussion. But I think on the whole, it's pretty well on par.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
And actually, one more thing I can say about that is I'm getting ready to publish volume 2 of the Atheist Handbook here in a couple of months. And I wrote a chapter on sex crimes.
Oh, wow.
In the ancient Near East, and comparing ancient Near Eastern law collections and what they say about rape and adultery to what the Old Testament laws say about this. And again, there are some places where there's a little bit of variation here and there, but on the whole, it's pretty much the same.
Right.
And that surprises people. It surprises people that, like, Deuteronomy 22, 28 to 29 says, if a man rapes an unbetrothed virgin, that he has to marry her. Yeah. And he can't divorce her all the days of his life. Like,
it's pretty shocking.
Like, do what? But that's not in any way uncommon in the ancient Near Eastern legal rationale. So, I think that those are, again, important nuanced discussions that we need to keep nuanced.
Yes.
And not, as unfortunate, I think so many Christian apologists do, try to defend a position that they already hold.
Yeah.
And flatten it thereby.
Absolutely. And I think on the flip side of that, the critics, I think we have to remember we live in a time that is far more advanced, a lot more progressive, and we got to remember that if we were living in that time period, we would just be another one of those people. We wouldn't have the same mindset we have now.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that we should look at.
Yeah, this is not. I say this in the book, the slavery book. Like, this is not meant to be like a critique of the morality of ancient people.
Sure.
The example that I give is like today, I wouldn't even dream of spanking my child.
Right.
Right. Let alone with like a switch or something.
Right.
But 50 years ago, that was the norm, right? I think 50 years ago was the norm. Can I then say that fathers didn't love their children because they beat them with switches? No, I think that's imposing a moral progress of mine on to them, and unfairly, right? Now, the problem is that when you come to an ancient text and you say this is the inspired word and the inspired laws of the immutable God, who is perfectly moral and unchanging, well, now you have to wrestle with, well, why is he giving commands for things that we consider to be immoral today? Right. You either have to argue, as some do, that they're not immoral, yikes, or you have to make the more nuanced argument that I still think is wrong, but that God is like condescending to the people and working with them where they are, and but there are all kinds of problems with that. So,
wow,
yeah.
But yeah, so when is your next volume 2 coming out?
It is at the editor now. It's all done. Kip Davis, Kip Davis, he's editing it for me.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and of course, he's, as you know, he's a brilliant guy, so he's going to do a phenomenal job with it. But once we get it, he's going to go and take a first pass at it, and then we're going to make a PDF out of it and send it out for peer review. We've got some scholars in mind that we're going to ask to do just that, and then once they give their peer review, then we'll make those corrections, and hopefully at the latest September. I'm hoping during the summer, but I'm trying to leave myself some time to not freak out. So,
well, I'm definitely going to try to get you back on when that arises.
Awesome. Yeah, love to.
All right, and you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.